So continuing on our topic of biodiversity, one of the ways that humans can impact biodiversity is by importing non-native species to an area that can then become invasive, or for some reason introducing a non-native species which then becomes invasive. So here's a prime example of an introduced species in the Florida Everglades, the Burmese python. The python was a pet to people, and after it got too big to remain in their homes, the people released it into the Everglades environment. This is a picture of a python eating an alligator in the Everglades. The Burmese python is one of the largest snake species on Earth, and they are now known to be breeding in the Everglades National Park and spreading throughout southern Florida. Originally, this Burmese python species is from Southeast Asia, and they're frequently found in Florida at this point. More than 2,000 pythons have been removed from the Everglades National Park and the surrounding area since 2002. This is likely only representing a fraction of the number of pythons that are present in the Everglades National Park. On the right here, we have a picture of a black and white tegu. This is an Argentina black and white tegu. It's a large non-native lizard that has been introduced into Florida region as well. It used to be pets for people, and it got too big, so they released it out into the Everglades. They are black and white in color with banding along the tail, and like I said, they can reach up to 4 feet in length. They basically compete with and prey upon Florida's native wildlife, including some threatened species. They are pretty hardy reptiles and can survive in burrows at temperatures as low as 35 degrees, and the females lay about 35 eggs a year. So when we talk about invasive species, we often refer to them as being non-native or alien species to the ecosystem, and the introduction of the species is causing or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm to the ecosystem or potentially harm to human health. Invasive species can be plants, animals, and other organisms, and we're going to see some examples of those in the next couple of slides. This is a figure from your textbook, and it depicts deliberately introduced species. More than 7,100 harmful, invasive, non-native species have been deliberately introduced or accidentally introduced into the United States. The ones on this diagram were deliberately brought into the U.S. either for landscaping or to be like an integrated pest management scenario, and other reasons as well. So purple loosestrife and the water hyacinth was mentioned earlier in the Florida area were brought in, European starling, the African honeybee I've already mentioned, and then a couple others here, the nutria, the salt cedar, the wild boar, the hydrilla, the Japanese beetle, and the giant toad. This diagram depicts those species that were accidentally introduced into the United States. The sea lamprey, which attaches to lake trout, the Argentina fire ant, which I already mentioned once, the brown tree snake, the Eurasian ruffy, the pigeon, the Formosan termite, the zebra mussel, the Asian longhorn beetle, the Asian tiger mosquito, and the gypsy moth larva. So some characteristics of successful invader species. Well, high reproductive rate makes their propagation bigger than native species, so they reproduce in a shorter time frame. Also, they are long-lived and have a high dispersal rate, and they're typically generalist species, which can live in a variety of ecosystem conditions, and they have high genetic variability. Oftentimes, there's a lack of predators with no threat to these species. Hence, they really don't have any predators that decrease their population. So if they have a high reproductive rate without predators, their numbers just continue to grow. They also have an ability to use all the given resources in a particular climate, and they overconsume those resources in an ecosystem and outcompete native species. And then here are characteristics of ecosystems that are vulnerable to invader species. Obviously, the climate must be similar to that of the invader or the non-native species. There's an absence of predators, as already mentioned. a low diversity of native species, absence of fire, and possible disturbance by human activities. Another species that has gained popularity as a non-native invasive species is the Asian carp. I have a link here for the Asian carp video, and this video is available in the D2L content for this week's lesson. Please take the time to watch the Asian carp video. It talks about how much they've spread throughout the United States, as is depicted here on the Mississippi River watershed, and it goes into some other species that are invasive as well, as far as the kudzu vine and a couple other species. The video really goes into the details of how the Asian carp has gotten into major waterways and multiplied far more than they should have. The Asian carp has spread throughout the Mississippi River watershed, as indicated here by the red dots, and they are impacting every species around them in the area, as basically they outcompete native fish for the resources. Now, how did the Asian carp get here? They arrived in the 1970s to eat the algae from fish farms. They escaped into the Mississippi River and basically increased their numbers at an exponential rate to push other species out, as well as they've taken over in mass numbers. They consume about 20% of their body weight and can weigh as much as 200 pounds. People are afraid of this massive overbreeding fish, and they're concerned that it may infest the Great Lakes and impact the fishing industry in the Great Lakes region. They're basically right now 97% of the biomass of the Illinois and Mississippi River, and they continue to spread throughout this watershed. So they're definitely outcompeting native fish if they're representing 97% of the biomass. Let's look at the kudzu vine. This was introduced in the 1930s and 1950s for decoration as a forage crop. This is an Asian plant that became popular in the southern United States, where it was planted on people's porches. It's also now known commonly as the vine that ate the South. Kudzu is a perennial which comes back every year, and the trailing vine can grow up to 1 foot per day, and it can get as long as 100 feet. A single root system can produce as many as 30 vines, which become hairy and woody and expand out in all directions, as is depicted here in the picture on the left side of the screen. The map on the right depicts how far the kudzu vine has spread since its introduction, and we actually have some kudzu vine up in Washington and Oregon that was introduced there by people as well. The pine bark beetle is another invasive species to discuss. The pine bark beetle is such a small beetle, as shown here in this picture. This is a match head. Strike a match to create a little flame. So it's a small little beetle that has infested the western United States, and it attacks pine trees. This is a picture depicting a coin, and then all these little tunnel systems of this beetle that occur beneath the surface of the bark. Here's the holes that they dig into to enter beneath the bark, and then the tunnel system that results from their inhabiting the tree itself. The loss of many trees to these beetles has been very severe thus far. Several species of pine bark beetles are presently killing lodgepole pine, ponderosa pine, limber pine, Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir, and Colorado blue spruce. The beetle is killing trees that are part of North America's northeastern front as well. These bugs are really hard to stop, and the mild winters in some areas with low rainfall are making the beetles' eggs live through the winter, and the result is when they hatch, you've got more beetles that are killing trees. So this is summer 2005. You'll see everything's very green, and a lot of coverage of these pine tree species. And then 4 years later, look at all the brown. All the brown indicates trees that have died as a result of the pine bark beetle infestation. So it can reap havoc in an area once that area is infected. And this is a map showing data from 2011 of the pine bark beetle and a couple other different invasive species and what's causing the tree mortality in this region. So green depicts forested lands and red depicts areas where there's been defined tree mortality and the areas have been measured. The main cause of this tree mortality is the mountain pine bark beetle. About 59% of the area that's shaded red are trees that were killed as a result of pine bark beetle infestation. Then 7% is caused by the spruce beetle and 5% by the fir engraver, and then the western balsam bark beetle, 5%. This is Wyoming area where Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone National Park is located. I travel to this area typically every summer, and it's just been eye-opening to see the expansiveness of the amount of tree area that's been impacted by the pine bark beetle. Every year I go out, there's more and more area that has dead pine trees because of this small insect. Over here in Idaho, you've got a large area that's been hit, and in Denver, Colorado as well. Let's look at another invasive species, the lionfish. The female lionfish can produce up to 50,000 eggs every 3 days, which means they have a high reproductive rate. The fish is actually visually stunning with her maroon and white stripes and long fan-like fins, and they're actually considered to be the most destructive exotic species in the marine waters off the coast of Florida and the Caribbean. They have huge appetites and consume dozens of organisms in one feeding. They're drastically reducing other fish populations and altering delicate reef ecosystems. Here's a picture depicting just a bunch of lionfish hanging out with not very many other species. The first lionfish was actually reported in southern Florida waters in 1985, with many additional sightings occurring until they were documented as an established species in the early 2000s. It's suspected that aquarium owners and negligent fishermen are responsible for the expansiveness of the red lionfish around the world. The lionfish was actually one of the most popular aquarium fish of all time. So it's considered that their release into the environment was that people had them as pets and they got too big, so they put them in the waters surrounding Florida, and from there they've expanded to what's depicted here in this map. This slide shows some numbers about the lionfish. Maturity is within 1 year, and they start laying 50,000 eggs every 3 days, and they can live to be about 30 years old. So they have high reproductive rate and long lifetime. This is the area where it's currently found around Florida and the Caribbean, but it's projected that it's going to go down around South America and inhabit those waters as well. During reef-sanctioned lionfish derbies, people go and try to remove the lionfish, and 28,000 lionfish have actually been removed from this region around the Florida Panhandle. Currently, the lionfish are documented to prey on over 100 other different types of fish species, and 1,000 lionfish can consume over 5 million prey fish in 1 year. So they are definitely having an impact on other smaller fish species populations. And they themselves do not have any known predators. So that in itself, laying this many eggs, living for 30 years, and no known predators, there's no check and balance in the system to maintain or control the population of the lionfish. So we will continue to evaluate other invasive species in the next short video.